Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today we are bringing Elaine Strauss, and I want to thank Elaine for joining us. We're going to be talking about clean rooms and design, and also one of the things that when I was talking about Elaine about this topic is how if you don't do it correctly, it can really cost you, right, Elaine?
Yeah.
So just to start, again, Vivian Juder Frankel with Pharma Salon. We do content and conferences for the pharmacy industry, predominantly compounding right now. And I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks, Vivian. I'm really excited to be here. Like she said, I'm Elaine Strauss. I'm a pharmacist by background. In my past life, I was a health system pharmacy manager at a couple different institutions in Pittsburgh and in Boston. And in those roles, I oversaw inpatient distribution, medication safety, day-to-day distribution of sterile products. And since 2018, I've transitioned to my current role with Working Buildings as a senior consultant, where I work with health system pharmacy compounding clients, 503B clients, as well as FDA clients, providing a variety of USP 797, 800, and CGMP regulatory support. So we support clients all the way from the design phase all the way to after construction monitoring with commissioning, construction, and any type of regulatory support that we can provide.
Great. So I reached out to you because I wanted to talk about health systems. Sometimes I feel like I don't have enough content to them specifically. And that's what got us started on talking about the clean rooms, especially with USP 800, because that's the big thing. And then people having to redesign their clean rooms or build new ones. And that's when we got on this conversation about things that can go wrong that end up costing you. And I'm wondering if you could kind of or just repeat that on what it is that what are the roads, how can it cost you? What are the roads that people go down? Does it mean it has to be entirely or fixed? Or I'll let you uh, do that.
Sure.
Somebody's
Yeah.
commenting on my lack of hat. I couldn't find it.
Yeah, so we can go ahead and jump right in, Vivian. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, there's so many things that can go wrong with construction. And one of the things I was hoping to discuss today and really share with the viewers here that are joining us are, what do you need to consider early on? It's so overwhelming to design a clean room. What are some of the first things that you can start with? When I listen and hear from my colleagues that are in health system pharmacy leadership roles right now, they're dealing with technician staffing shortages, drug shortages. There's so many things on their plate, and if they're having to design a clean room also, goodness, like how do they carve out the time that they need to really think about doing it right and thinking about their workflow? So one of the first things that I always suggest coming in is assembling your team. So you've got your health system, hospital, facilities leadership or engineering leadership, your construction project management firm, or frequently your internal facilities team has a construction project manager. You've got an architect firm, typically someone local to your hospital, someone who's familiar with local fire safety codes and building codes. Um, a commissioning agent, someone who will go in and make sure all your I's are dotted and T's are crossed with your mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, and a clean room consultant, someone who can really support you from the beginning through the end and even possibly provide ongoing support after your project is complete. So each of these individuals plays a unique role and are important to have in your team. The next thing you want to think about is, are you renovating your existing space? Are you landlocked? Is there nowhere else that you can expand beyond? And do you have to stay within your existing clean room space? Or do you have the opportunity to consider new space? So if you're looking at a current facility or a new space, what exists adjacent to that proposed clean room space? Are there food preparation areas? Is the hospital cafeteria nearby? Hopefully not. Is your department pharmacy a break room nearby? So those are all some of the things you want to think about. Other limitations might be ceiling height. Are there other limitations with your HVAC system or capacity with current HVAC systems that you'll want to consider? So another important thing also to consider early on and make that decision early on is whether you'll go with a stick build approach or go with a modular vendor that'll construct a modular approach. And there's really pluses and minuses to both. A stick build approach really can potentially offer a lower upfront cost, But with that comes a potential greater risk of contamination and debris that will contaminate the materials within your environment. You know, when you think about the supplies as they arrive through the loading dock, through the hospital, there's a lot of quality control that comes with making sure that those supplies and materials are delivered appropriately, prepared appropriately, and then installed appropriately. And on the flip side, a modular approach is, they're constructed of prefabricated panels that are made in a highly controlled, cleaner environment, so to speak. So there's definitely advantages to it. It typically involves and allows you to have a cleaner startup environment. So again, they're both customizable. They both have their pluses and minuses. If you do go with a stick build approach, you'll typically need to consider future potential increased downtime needs for touch-ups, repairs, repair of your epoxy paint, et cetera, et cetera. And then another really key part of determining how you first approach your facility is looking at your workflows. So when you look at a typical pharmacy, hospital pharmacy, average 400 to 500 bed community, teaching hospital or community hospital, they're not just doing one thing in that clean room. You've got first doses, stat medications, batches, potentially doing high risk or non-sterile to sterile compounding. Are they doing TPNs? Do they have investigational drug services? Do they have allergenic extracts that they're doing? So all of these unique workflows have considerations, have different workflows, have different pathways that those medications follow when they go in and when they go out. And so you want to look at each one of those different workflows and what are some of the bottlenecks? What is currently holding up efficient workflows with each one of those? From a workflow standpoint, also, do you anticipate that the volume of your hospital facility, are they anticipating a construction of a new tower? Are they increasing their patient beds in the future? And therefore, does that translate to a higher volume and increased volume in your clean room? If you're currently outsourcing, let's say TPNs or other agents within your clean room, do you have a thought or plan on insourcing them in the future? Again, those are all things that can change your future workflow, change the needs of the facility when you're thinking about what your future space needs to look like.
So let me interrupt and ask about workflow. When does that come into the design process? Should that be the first thing that you do? Let's say you bring in a consultant and you have your architect. Is that when you just start kind of working through your workflow? And then at that point, are you going through what your workflow is, or you may be designing a new workflow for what you'd like to see in a new space?
I think it really can be both models. So what's important is when you're looking at workflow today, that workflow could possibly change dramatically in 5 years, in even 3 years when your facility is constructed. I think there's so many unstable aspects right now with the industry, for example, supply chain. If you're planning on having this one very niche product outsourced and then that supply chain just is halted one day 3 to 5 years from now, you're going to want to have an ability and the flexibility within your space to insource that. So I think it's important to look at both current state, current model, but also future proofing. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, and thinking about what might change in the future and having the space that's flexible enough to accommodate those changes as well.
Okay, we have a comment. I don't really understand it, so you're going to have to explain it. He says his issue is with cleaning of HD products in receiving or storage area under negative pressure. In this scenario, you contaminate your room with, if not done in a containment hood.
Yeah, sure. So great comment there. One of the things that we see when coming into existing clean room facilities when we're asked to look at workflow and help them design a new space is frequently these spaces that were, maybe they had their first renovation back in 2005 or 2006 to get compliant with the first editions of USP 797. Those spaces did not have a negative pressure receiving space. So when you have your hazardous drug products, they're coming in off the loading dock, they're coming in through your facility, they're getting unpacked, there is well-known and well-established contamination on the outside of those products. So those need to be received within a negative pressure space One of the things also that you recommend is if you don't already have an industrial hygienist within your hospital facility, having someone come in, and I'm not an industrial hygienist, but I work with a bunch of them, is having them come in to take a risk-based assessment of what are the highest chances and likelihood of contamination. So certainly making sure you have adequate PPE to protect the employee when they are unpacking those products. And those individuals can help to recommend the most proper containment controls, whether they're simply PPE as an SOPs as an administrative control, or whether increased needs for engineering controls like a containment hood that was stated there are necessary for unpacking. I think if you're unpacking or just receiving a hazardous drug product and you see that there is a spill or that that product is cracked, then absolutely that's a very high risk contamination strategy that needs to be taken and contained within a containment hood.
Okay. And of course, anybody else chime on in. We love to get the comments and address those other than what I can think about. What are some lessons learned or where you've seen things go wrong during or after construction?
Yeah, so lots of things here, and again, that's one of the important things is of getting that team in place early on. And one of the key things that we see oftentimes in older designs or other facilities that were frequently brought in as rescue missions, after the facility is built, several years go by, and they just continue to get ongoing environmental monitoring challenges, is when a facility is designed without a separate wet anteroom and dry anteroom. So when you think about the layouts that are proposed within USP 797 and 800, you've got your anteroom, you've got your non-hazardous buffer room for sterile, non-hazardous drug mixing, and then you've got your negative pressure hazardous drug buffer room. If you have an anteroom that's adjacent to each of those, you think about the activities that are going on. You're washing your hands, you're garbing, all of those activities are generating particles and viable particulates. And if you've got a negative pressure space immediately adjacent to that anteroom, you've got a very high likelihood, it's almost established that the particles, those viables, are going to be pulled under and mechanically transported through that offset balancing airstream into that negative pressure hazardous drug mixing room and likely contributing to contamination of that space. So one thing that we see as a lesson learned, and we try to make sure are incorporated in all our designs, is a separated wet anteroom. So when you first come into the facility, you're doing your hand washing, you're doing your garbing, and then you step into almost what's an airlock, so to speak. It's an ISO 7 dry anteroom with very minimal activities in that space, very minimal to no storage. And then from that dry anteroom, you then enter into your negative pressure HD ISO 7 mixing room or your positive pressure non-HD buffer room through that space. So that's a big lesson learned, and that's a key recommendation we always have. Another key aspect is throughout construction and even post-construction is a lack of construction quality control. And what is construction quality control? So when you're thinking about who you're bringing in, whether it's a local vendor, a local general contractor to do a stick build model, or you've got a modular vendor coming in and installing those prefabricated walls, there are a lot of potential, more so with stick build, but there's a lot of potential possibly for errors in installation or unapproved substitution of parts. There's potential for when parts are delivered into the facility that they're not properly stored, they're not properly wiped down before they're transported into the classified spaces. There's a potential for staff and construction workers and vendors to not be properly garbed and not following what we like to call a clean construction protocol during construction. So as a clean room design construction phase progresses, you get into cleaner and cleaner and cleaner phases that require more and more higher levels of garb. And it's critical that you have someone overseeing that process. Another example that we see is if you are going with a stick build model that requires, the application of epoxy paint. If that epoxy paint is not being applied properly, that doesn't have the proper cure time, if the wrong kind of caulking is used, those are all examples. They're easy substitutions, supply chain issues. We couldn't get the right paint. We couldn't get the right caulk. You really want to have someone there overseeing that process.
So how do you know? Yeah. How do you, what can happen if you use the wrong stuff? Your environmental monitoring issues when you're actually using the clean room?
Oh, absolutely. So, improperly applied epoxy paint, it can lead to chipping, it can lead to the surfaces of those products being more easily damaged. If you're thinking about more likely a negative pressure space, if you have joints or other areas that were not properly caulked, for example, um, anything that's ceiling mounted that requires caulking in a negative pressure space, again, definition of negative pressure, you're constantly going to be pulling in particles, pulling in contaminants. So,
Hmm.
really making sure that envelope is as tightly sealed as possible is so important. So, absolutely, you'll see those evident in future environmental monitoring results. One example, we had a situation where a negative pressure clean room was having environmental monitoring failure. So we asked them, do you have caulking? Are the ceiling tiles caulked? Do you have the proper, precautions in place? Even outlets, is there caulking evident there? So we have them go back and repeat those steps that were not done during the construction process. So,
So going back to then your quality control, so you need a
yeah.
specific person who is going to be basically, so who brings on in all those products? I'm sorry, I know we've got a bunch of people here who probably know this, but I'm just going through my own thing. So is it the contractor then who's purchasing the products? And then do you need somebody who's going to go through them with them to make sure that they're all up to standard?
Yeah, typically the construction quality control person is there overseeing. Usually it's the purchasing department, typically it's the facilities department, or however the project is structured. I think each project is structured a little bit differently, but making sure that someone is
Hmm.
there to oversee that. And a lot of times it's someone internal to the facility, it's someone within the facilities department. But if they don't have someone to that can perform that service, that can be done as an exterior outside consultant.
Do you think that most health systems have that person?
It can really vary. It varies based on the size of the health system. It really varies, but I think having someone in that capacity is so important and so valuable. If the facility doesn't have the budget to have someone on hand full time, going in to make quality control site visits is another process. It's something that we do. We've got a checklist where we go down the checklist, especially our QC engineers, and it's something that they live and breathe, and they see those lessons learned at all these facilities and help to point out those errors before they become long-term issues.
Okay, we do have another question. Is there a distinction between a dry anti-room versus an airlock, or is it just semantics?
Yeah, so in the case of wet anteroom versus dry anteroom, your dry anteroom really needs to be ISO 7 classification to meet the classifications of that, and then going into either your ISO 7 buffer room, either your negative pressure or non-negative pressure. And airlock is typically used more so in
You kind of went out for me. I don't know if you
oh,
went out for
sure.
everybody.
Yeah,
Um,
a dry anteroom. Can you hear me now, Vivian? Okay, great. So a
yeah.
dry anteroom is
Yes.
really you have a distinction between your wet anteroom and then a dry anteroom. Dry anteroom again is that ISO 7 space where you're going directly into your either negative pressure HD buffer room or your um, non-hazardous positive pressure buffer room. An airlock is typically referred to in other terms as a pass-through. Typically, an airlock is more so used as a pass-through between, let's say, like a clean not classified space. We typically see a storage room or a clean storage room going between that. If you have a staging area, a lot of times we'll see, certainly in CGMP designs, you'll have the clean not classified space where it's not an ISO classified space, but it does have HEPA filtration. So it's a cleaner, it's a step up from just your general workspace. A lot of times you'll use that space as staging, as storage. And again, all of that is to minimize the amount of drug, amount of product, and amount of supply that's stored within your classified spaces. So airlock in that sense is really more so either a person-sized pass-through or a cart-sized pass-through.
Got it. You talked a little bit about, now we're past our 15 minutes, so I don't know if you want to address this, which is future proofing the pharmacy clean room design, or just jump into a couple more quick tips and tricks, because that's what I did end up calling this, to make sure that,
Absolutely.
everything goes smoothly.
Sure. Couple other final points with future proofing is, do you have plans in the future to bring in additional technology, additional robotics? You want to make sure that you've thoroughly considered the space for that. Do you plan to increase your hazardous drug volume in the future? Do you want to make sure you go ahead and set up your HVAC appropriately within that negative pressure space? So if there's any venting that needs to be done above the ceilings to almost stage that is something that's suggested. You want to really have an ongoing focus on environmental monitoring. So setting up a committee, reviewing those results frequently, sharing those with the frontline staff are so important and valuable for the team to really understand how their actions and activities and their movement within the clean room really impact the future success of the space. And then also some really important tips to consider are how to continue compounding while your construction is underway. So certainly it is considered an insanitary condition by FDA to continue compounding immediately adjacent to any construction spaces without proper containment. So frequently we'll see clean rooms that will move into what's called a segregated compounding area or a temporary compounding space with reduced beyond use dates while their main area is being constructed. Other sites will consider outsourcing some of their supply. If you're a larger facility and you have some satellite compounding pharmacy areas within your facility, you can send products to those other various facilities to be compounded. And then lastly, you want to make sure that whether it's the designer, whether it's the architect, whoever you have on board has thoroughly considered the layout and the spatial orientation of your space with respect to the equipment that you're bringing in, looking at turning radius, because you can design the best, most efficient, nicest looking clean room, but if your equipment does not fit, then you can't operate and you can't serve.
You see that happen a lot?
We do. So we've got one of my colleagues, he'll go in and, he'll test with a, 20-point turn, making sure the hood will fit in, on his CAD equipment. But that is such an important part of those early configurations and making sure that everything will fit before you get to construction phase.
Okay, great. Does anybody else have any questions? I know I just have one more, which is probably, again, could just be me and my unfamiliarity with the process. But is there a designated, is there a process for the designated person within the facility who's going to be heading this up? Is it always the same department? Do you pick one of your quality people, or is it the person in charge?
Yeah, I think I got
room should be built with the SOPs taken in. Yeah, here's a good comment. Clean room should be built with SOPs taken into consideration and designed to facilitate those guidelines, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Certainly with SOPs taken into account. Also, when you're operating under a temporary compounding space, you want to have temporary SOPs, which will oversee the administrative controls while you're in that temporary space. Make sure that staff have signed off on those as well. So very important point as well.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Any
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to
more
chat.
questions? Last chance? Comments? Yeah, and we'll talk again soon. And hopefully we'll see you at our event. I hope everybody's paying attention. It's going to be in October. Tune in for details at a later date. Thanks, everyone.